So bring that slideshow up. All right, so as Mr. White introduced me, my name is Conlen, Conlen Breheny. I'm a past film student of Mr. White's, like he said, at the old campus. And I'm currently in Los Angeles studying visual effects at a school called Noman, School of Visual Effects. So I came here today to talk to you guys about the visual effects pipeline and the roles in visual effects and CGI. So even if you guys aren't necessarily, everyone has their own thing in film. Film is such a vast place that you can do so many things within film. So even if you're not specifically interested in visual effects, this will at least help you understand kind of the basics of how it works, which is always a very good thing, is for everyone in a production to kind of know what everyone else is doing. And in addition to that, you guys are also still juniors and seniors in high school, so you might not know necessarily where you're going, and visual effects might be intriguing to you, or maybe you already have an interest in visual effects. So I'm going to go through some of that. We're going to start off with about me. So I'm going to start off by playing my reel. If you guys don't know, a reel is going to be just like a 1 to 2 minute long cut of all of your work. And for visual effects specifically, it's very important. A reel is generally what's going to give you a job. I still have 3 years of university left, so my reel is, I'm looking forward to how it improves in the future, but currently it's a lot of stuff from high school and a little bit outdated, but still it's pretty okay. And I didn't do the fair warning for, I've been told that you generally don't want to have like whatever music you want to have in your reel because it might just annoy the producers. So there are some parts where it is just silent besides the sound effects, but I'm going to play it now. And it's about 2 minutes long.
Scene 14 Apple, take 1, mark. Action!
So that's the reel. Apologies for the silence at some parts. Oh, and it went away. All right. So as I mentioned, I was at Warren Tech TV Video. This is in my junior year, so 2020. And while I was at TV Video, I started experimenting with some stuff with visual effects. My background was I started using like software like After Effects when I was like 12, making like just video game edits, stuff like that, motion design. And through that though, After Effects, that software, I discovered kind of the concept of visual effects, and I became more interested in it. And especially in this class was my first time just running some tests. So this is like a 3D model of a speeder that I put in my garage. This guy right here, this water and water vapor is digital CG added into this plate. And then actually, and I'm sure you guys will be meeting him within a few months probably, Ethan Lean was also another alumni of this class. And he came over when I was at Warren Tech and presented like I'm doing right now And he's like a music video director, editor, colorist. And so he actually, through his presentation, we exchanged social media contacts, and then he found my work, and then I ended up doing some shots for a video of him, a video he was directing in the Salt Flats, and that was in the last semester of my junior year. So that was some cool stuff. And then I don't know, guys, I don't know if you guys used to know, but this program used to be 2 years long, but they've since cut it to only a 1-year program. So I actually came into it expecting to be in there for 2 years, but since they cut it to 1 year, I had to figure out what I wanted to do for my senior year. And so as I'll talk about later, a lot of the computer graphics and 3D modeling, that kind of stuff within visual effects is also used in game development. So I actually was able to go into the game development course at Warren Tech as well for my senior year. And there I was able to continue my journey with learning some computer graphics stuff. And so that whole time I had been looking for what I wanted to do for college and for school. And I discovered a school called Noman School of Visual Effects, which is probably just the top visual effects school in the United States right now. And I found it through a website that I'll show you guys later. But at the time it was ranked #1 in the world in 2020. But they reevaluate each year based on student work. So it's not currently #1, but we're hoping to take that back. So I'm currently here in Hollywood, California, and I'm about to start my second year there. And some of the stuff I made in my first year, we definitely focused more on gen ed fundamentals in that first year, but we still had also some fundamental 3D classes. So I was able to make some kind of cool stuff, like you saw this, and then the full CG, full CG, full CG. And this guy, it was based off of a painting, but it is actually just 3D. All right, so that's just an introduction to me, but the reason I actually came today was to talk to you guys about visual effects and the pipeline and the different jobs within it, just so you guys can kind of get an understanding of it as you work with it in the future, as maybe you're a director, you're working with visual effects, or maybe you, from this presentation or from a past interest, you decide to become a visual effects artist yourself. So I'm gonna go talk about the whole process. So just like with everything, the process actually starts in pre-production. So you guys probably know a film there's pre-production, production, and post-production, and then you ship the film. So here in pre-production, what's going to happen is the director and the writer, they're going to be writing this script, making everything, seeing how building their world essentially. And then while they're doing that, they're going to want some visual pieces of their world. You know, they're going to want some concept art. So they're going to actually get some concept artists together, and they'll read the script, they'll discuss with the directors, with the art directors, and kind of see what kind of world they want to build. So I found a lot of resources for The Jungle Book from 2016. So this pre-production part, I'm going to show some examples from that movie in specific. But you can see here, this was a concept for what this orangutan character was going to look like. They also do concepts for environments. This is some kind of temple thing. I haven't actually seen the movie, full transparency. And then they also do concept art for scenes. So this is the scene of some rampaging animals. So they do concepts just to kind of develop the look, and that's going to drive the look of the project in the future. So after that, there's going to be storyboard artists who are going to work with the director and also the director of photography or cinematographer. And so in case you guys don't know, cinematographer, director, photographer, that's not necessarily just the person who's shooting with the camera. That's the person who's going to be setting the shots, the lighting. They're going to be on set working directly with the director. They're basically developing the look of the movie with the director. So that's why storyboard artists are going to work so closely with them, because they're going to draw each shot, and I'm sure you guys will learn soon, if you haven't already gone over it, stuff like different camera angles, different camera moves, stuff like that. That's going to all be initially developed in these storyboards, and that's going to be based on the script as well. And then so here's the first kind of thing where computer graphics comes in. Although actually, let me backtrack a little bit. So I'll talk more about 3D and computer graphics later, but just so you guys know, concept artists actually do, instead of just illustrating and painting, they actually do a lot of the time integrate computer graphics elements. So I don't know for sure, but there's a chance that they originally created a 3D basic scene to get the perspective and camera right, and then they went in and they started painting, and they also do something called photo bashing, where they add photographs in Photoshop, paint them in, mix them in. And anyway, so back to pre-production. With previs, so pre-visualization, based on everything we've talked about. So we have the script, we have the concept art, we have the storyboards. They're going to go in with previs, and they're going to make it's from a distance, it doesn't necessarily look that bad, but if you look up close, these are pretty rough 3D renderings. And that is just because they're supposed to be very primitive blockouts of what the light is going to be, what the camera angle is going to be, and where the people are going to be. But they're not necessarily supposed to look that good. But this previs is going to drive while they're shooting the film, while they're doing the visual effects, they're going to be using this previs, looking at this previs, and they're going to be using that to drive how they work. And an example of that is, this is the previs, and then I'm going to go to the actual final shot from that previs. You'll see that even though it's not necessarily exactly the same, you can definitely tell that they used that a lot while they were building that look. So that's the final shot, and I'll go between them a few times. Definitely change things, definitely, I mean, yeah, definitely. As they might be on that set, they might decide, oh, this suits our creative vision more, this angle, or this shows our characters better, our actors better, just whatever reason. So it's not necessarily a hard, fast rule, but it is definitely going to be a very helpful visualizer for pre-visualization. And so next step of that is actually going to be called tech viz. So it's kind of the secondary part of previs, where they're going to use all those 3D scenes, and then they're going to actually start integrating digital versions of real life restraints. So you can see here, they're going to try building these digital, like actual camera rigs. They're going to be using measurements, collecting measurements, seeing where lights should be. And because in CG, you can make a camera fly 1 million miles an hour. You can make it do whatever you want, but they're going to actually be filming this stuff. So what they need to do is make sure that it is feasible within physical properties of the world. So they're going to collect measurements, what lenses were used in this previs, what exact positions of the camera, like height, angle, etc. So we can see this is from like the Avengers or something, and this is from a movie with Doctor Strange in it. You can see here Doctor Strange on the left, this is the plate they filmed, but then this is the previs, so they actually matched it with the camera height when they shot that in real life on that green screen stage. All right, so next up after that, so all of this pre-production is pretty much wrapped up, and now they need to do production. But while they're producing the movie, or doing the production on the movie, which is when they actually go down and shoot the movie, they already need to be working with visual effects artists. So that means they have to establish which houses they're going to be working with. So these are a bunch of different visual effects companies. They're some of the biggest ones. So Weta, that's New Zealand. They did Lord of the Rings. Industrial Light and Magic, that's Lucasfilm, like Star Wars. They're probably one of the biggest ones. DNEG, Digital Negative, really big. Digital Domain, really big. MPC, The Mill. Animal Logic, they're in Australia. Framestore, Scanline. These are all just some of the biggest companies here. And so there's going to be a process called VFX bidding. And that's going to be where they're going to take that script. They're going to take the shot list that they have, which I'm sure you guys will talk about. That's just like a list of all the shots the movie will have. And essentially, they're going to need to decide which companies are going to work on which shots. So in this modern day and age, movies are going to be, most of the shots in movies are going to be visual effects shots, and movies have hundreds and like thousands of shots in them. So not hundreds of thousands, just hundreds or thousands. But that means that one company would be way too much work to do. So they actually are going to split this work between a bunch of different companies. And the way that's decided is in a process called bidding, which is essentially where the company will put out these shots, the production company, the client, and then these VFX houses will be like, okay, we'll do this shot, these shots for this much money in this much time. The issue with this, though, is that these companies, these visual effects companies, all want work. So what they're going to do is they're going to be like, they're going to try and give them good deals. These companies are going to be like, we're going to do it in this much time for this much money, and that's less than this company. But this bidding process is actually going to be causing issues a lot of the time, because what that means is that they cut their budgets so that they get picked. But that also means that they get rushed. So anytime you see like the Thor movie recently had some really pretty bad visual effects shots in it. Like, I don't know if you guys saw that movie with the floating kid's head or whatever. Looked pretty bad. People made a lot of memes about it. However, the issue is that the people working at these companies are not amateurs. These are the top 0.0001% visual effects artists. But whenever you see a bad shot like that in a movie, that means that this bidding process forced that company to be like, okay, we have a small budget, we're going to overwork you 80 hours a week, and you have to finish this shot in like 2 hours. So essentially 99.9% of the time, if you see a bad visual effects shot in like a big Hollywood movie, it's going to be due to like this bidding process is causing it to be, people to be overworked, and unfortunately just the budget not being high enough. But anyways, so once we're during production, so we're going to be shooting the film. That's where they shoot all the principled photography and collect all the data that they need. There's going to be an artist called the visual effects supervisor. So we can see here this guy on the left, his name's Hugo Guerra. He's a Portuguese VFX soup. And you can see he's holding two things, and he's in a green screen stage. So this thing on the right that he's holding is called a Macbeth chart. And that is going to essentially be, this is not just like an image you print from Google. This is a specific sheet. They're really expensive, honestly. Like at first, it's like, oh, why don't I just print one? All these colors are specific pigments that are specifically engineered to like reflect certain wavelengths of light so that they can exactly match colors in their software. So if you printed it, the pigments wouldn't be like exactly right or accurate. So that's what they use these sheets for, just to get color matching when they're bringing all of these elements together. And then on this left, you see he's holding a giant shiny chrome ball. And so what that's going to be used for is you'll see in this bottom row, this right here is a camera on something called a Nodal Ninja, which is it's going to be attached to a tripod. And then if you have your camera, normally if your camera's on a tripod, it will spin from the base. Like I'm going to grab one of the black magics here. It'll spin from here. But that means where the center of the lens is, I don't think, there's not a lens on this guy right now. That's going to be shifting, which is going to cause like a parallaxing effect, if that makes any sense. So the Nodal Ninja will allow it to pivot from the center of the lens, which the reason we need to do that is because we're going to be taking 360-degree photographs, which you can see in the bottom left here. We're going to take photos at every angle, and then you can use software to stitch them together into this one image. And then you also take multiple brackets of these images, it's called, which means you take them at different exposure levels. Normally you would do like 7 to 9, but you can see here, this guy is dark, and then you shoot one that's brighter than that, brighter than that, brighter than that. The reason for that is when it's really bright, you're not going to get detail in the highlights, and when it's really dark, you're not going to get detail in the shadows. If you take like 9 of these brackets, you can use software to combine them together into a high dynamic range image, which is going to contain all of the light information, and that'll be used in visual effects later. And essentially that will be used to light CG, like 3D objects, and in a spherical way, shooting light rays from basically like a fake sky, so you can match the colors, the light of what was on set. And the reason for this chrome ball is that you use this as reference, so once they have that 3D 360 image called an HDRI, you're going to bring in a 3D chrome ball and put it next to this guy, and then essentially you can rotate that image that you have in there around until the angle matches exactly what it looks like in this ball, because it will hypothetically match up. And as you might imagine, I've done this a few times. If you have a camera and you're doing the Nodal Ninja, boom, 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 like whatever, 8 pictures this way, then tilt it up, 8 pictures that way, 8 pictures that way, and you also have to hold it down so it takes bracketed photos. That can take a long time. So now there's some cameras like this guy is called the Ricoh Theta, and that is just going to have 2 wide fisheye lens on either side, and you just press it, and then it takes the 360 image and stitches it together all at once. So that guy is definitely very helpful. And then, so another part of what a visual effects supervisor is going to do, so in case I didn't clarify that, they're going to be the person on set who's going to be keeping track of all this. So they're going to be taking the 360 images, they're going to be making sure Macbeth charts are photographed, and they'll make sure the green screens are set up correctly, and part of that is these tracking markers on here. When you're tracking in 3D, which I'll talk about more, it's essentially you have to see how the camera moves, and then you have to recreate that in 3D. What it needs to do is it needs to grab onto little parts of the image and then track them across time. But if you have a flat green screen, it's not going to be able to do that. So they add these markers here, and that is going to allow it to grab onto that marker as it's tracking. And then, so another part is going to be motion capture, which I'm sure you guys have heard about. These guys are going to have all these nodes on their suits, and that's a very similar thing. Some of these actually have little gyroscopes and actual position trackers where it can get the exact location, but some of them are also just meant for contrast, so software can detect how they're moving. And then they also have facial rigs. So essentially this on-set VFX supervisor is just going to make sure that while the movie is being filmed, all of the necessary resources for VFX work are being recorded and done. All right, so that was production. So that production is shooting the movie, getting everything ready. As you guys, a lot of you guys, I'm assuming, will be interested in the production side of things, like directing, etc. Although directors go through the whole process. But now it's going to be the start of post-production. So up in here, this is just a graph that I'll come back to later as well. but this is kind of the process of how everything moves along. So everything was shot in production with this camera, and a lot of the times productions will use different cameras. And so all of that footage is going to get delivered to something called the digital imaging technician, which is going to be a house that is going to take in all of this camera, the dailies as well. There's a process called dailies, which is like a review process. So the DIT will kind of handle the dailies with the director reviewing things. But anyways, so as that footage is coming in, VFX is going to need a lot of specific information. So as you guys may or may not know yet, there is going to be stuff like cameras have different focal lengths. So a 100mm lens is going to be very zoomed, whereas like a 16 is going to be like a wide angle lens. And then also, as you're shooting on different cameras, you can be shooting in different formats. So any of you guys know what like log footage is or raw footage?
We haven't gone over that too much, but some
Yeah,
might know.
definitely will be getting into that, I'm assuming, as well. But essentially, you can shoot footage in these different ways. But for visual effects, you want a conformed, kind of standardized way, and you need all the information about this footage. So this house is going to consolidate all that, put it in metadata files, which is essentially, you have your footage with metadata, and the metadata is just the information, like here's the camera, this is the focal length it was at, shutter speed, etc. And so now that DIT is going to deliver everything to first the editing house, actually. They're going to make an initial cut. So when you guys know when we have footage, we'll shoot like the slate, the clapper, it'll be like take A1, whatever. And then they'll also have to be like action. So that the footage that shot has, there's going to be parts of that aren't going to be used in visual effects because the editor is going to cut out the slate stuff. That's just going to be used for like syncing audio and just making sure everything's good. So this editor is going to do an initial edit, and then they'll send a file that contains the information about the edit. So you can see in this visualizer, you can see, okay, here all the slate parts would be cut out. Oh, and maybe this shot, we only need that part. So they'll send this edit decision list to the visual effects editor, and then they'll ingest everything and they'll have the footage that they need so they know what they can start working on and make sure they're working on the correct range and parts of the image. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about CG versus visual effects. All right, so CG stands for computer graphics, and I'll talk about it a lot more, but essentially that is going to be like 3D models, things that are rendered in like a 3D software. So up here we can see this is a still from Puss in Boots, the new one, and this is a full CG shot. It's a feature animation, so feature animation is normally going to be full CG. So there's not a single photographic element in the shot, it is all 3D models. So this is a CG movie. However, this movie is, I think this is Endgame. This is going to be a visual effects shot. However, visual effects is going to heavily use CG. So you can see here, Valkyrie is not sitting on a horse. She's sitting on some kind of rig thing. However, there's a horse now. That is a CG horse. So visual effects employs and uses CG all of the time. And most of the jobs in visual effects are as CG roles. However, something like Puss in Boots is only going to be CG, and they're not going to be integrating with footage. So, and you guys see Oppenheimer? Nice, nice. So Christopher Nolan, he's actually one of my favorite directors, but one thing that he does do is with his marketing, he kind of claims, he's kind of anti-VFX a little bit. So in this specific movie, some people have interpreted it as him saying there's no visual effects in the movie, which is false. What he did claim is that there's no CGI. So now that we kind of know the difference between that, we can see that that means that as they're shooting photographic plates, so on set, they're shooting with their cameras, sometimes they need to combine things together. So we'll talk about a process called compositing at the very end, because that's the last step in visual effects. But that's going to be different elements, so like different pieces of footage, maybe like green screen stuff, compositing it together. So if Christopher Nolan's claim that there was no CGI is true, that does mean there was still there's I think more than 100 visual effects artists who worked on this film. So they're still doing a lot of visual effects work, but mostly with this shot footage, this photographic stuff. He did claim that there was no CGI at all. However, it has been kind of uncovered that that was not true. That was just kind of a marketing tactic. What he actually meant is there's no full CG shots. So like I mentioned, this is a feature animation. This is full CG. This has some photographic elements, as you can see, but also a lot of the time, visual effects movies will have full CG shots. Like with Iron Man, they're normally not going to, if he's flying around, they're not going to try and do some stunt actor do that. They're going to just animate a 3D Iron Man in a 3D city. So there can be full CG shots in visual effects movies. And so Nolan, in Oppenheimer, there was no full CG shots, but there actually were CG artists working on it. So he's just kind of a marketing guy with his no VFX, no CGI thing, but that is about that. And so next we'll talk about visual effects and versus special effects or practical effects. So a lot of the time people will say, oh, special effects and visual effects interchangeably, but they're actually different. So a special effect is going to be something that is done for real, physically in the real world. So like here we see this explosion was actually done with like some pyrotechnics unit that actually exploded something in real life, and they shot that. Or here, this is another Nolan movie, this is Dark Knight. We can see the semi-truck, he actually did flip a semi-truck with like giant pistons for real. So that is a special effect. Versus here, this is a CG fully digital explosion. So that's going to be a visual effect, a CG visual effect. But also, just an addendum, they do combine a lot of the time. So a lot of the time they might shoot a special effect explosion, but maybe it's on like a black plate. So they'll use visual effects to composite that special effect on top of footage. And then another case of combining the two, as we can see here from Guardians of the Galaxy 3, this Nebula stunt double has special effects makeup to make her look like Nebula. However, this one was Weta who did this. They actually ended up fully head replacing to make Nebula's head. So they use that special effect as kind of a base. And also when you're acting, it's kind of easier. I'm not an actor, but I can imagine and I've heard that it's easier if you're actually kind of immersed while you're acting instead of just surrounded by a green screen with like people in motion capture suits. But so they have that special effect as kind of a base, but then they end up just pretty much fully CG replacing her, and you can also see her clothing changed, which means that this is a full CG Nebula. And then another example of this is from Solo. So this plate was shot with a drone in, I think it was Austria or something, somewhere in Europe. And you might think, okay, they have a photographic plate and then they did a CG simulated explosion. This actually was a photographic explosion that was shot with some kind of underwater chemical reaction type thing. And they did it again. So they had two real things that they shot on footage, and then they just used visual effects to put them together. So this explosion was practically done, special effects, but it was VFX was used to composite it together. All right, so I've been talking about a lot about computer graphics and CG, and yeah, so most of the roles in CG and VFX are going to be using 3D software and computer graphics. So I've taken some screenshots of some of the software here. So this is going to be Maya. This is one of the two main softwares that I use, and these are called DCCs, Digital Content Creation Apps. This one is called Blender. It's a really popular free one. Has anyone used this around here? Some people use Blender, nice. That's a really popular indie one. So Maya is going to be the industry standard, especially for like animation. And then Blender's a really big, and it's really nice that it's free. So it's really big for enthusiasts and hobbyists. And some small indie productions will be using it. But there are no large studios that use it. Something with because of the nature of its licensing, there'd be some weird legal stuff if they used it. And so here is Houdini. This is my favorite software. This is essentially like a Maya on steroids kind of thing, except it's only used for specific tasks that are normally highly technical. So in Maya, you might animate a character. In Houdini, you might do a physics simulation of a gasoline explosion. And so now bottom right, we have something called Cinema 4D. This was my first 3D software. This guy is not really used in visual effects at all besides for indie guys. However, it is the industry standard for motion graphics. So CG is also used in motion graphics. If you see those commercials of like, oh, here's a lemon and then splash of water, or like the cans are flying around with cool light rays hitting them. That's going to be CG. Sometimes they shoot those practically too. But if they are doing those in 3D, it's normally going to be done with Cinema 4D. So yeah, one note about this is I'll be talking about a lot of the stuff you can do with these kind of software today. And if any of it interests you, Blender is free to download. And then also, this is really cool. So Maya is normally like $6,000 a year. But for students, and this applies to a ton of 3D software, which is awesome, they're going to go ahead and give students it for free while you're a student, as a high schooler or a college student. And same with Houdini. It's a limited license, but it's free. Cinema 4D comes with Maxon One. So the company that makes Cinema 4D is called Maxon. And even if some of you guys are going to be like, okay, I'm going to stick to just regular editing and color grading instead of visual effects, The Max on One subscription comes with a suite of plugins called the Red Giant Suite that I mentioned earlier. Ethan Lean, another alumni, at least when he came and talked to our class, he talked kind of about how he used the Red Giant Suite. But that's going to be another educational deal where you can get it for free every 6 months for $10. And all of these things, all you do is you just upload your like school email or student ID, stuff like that, and you can go ahead and get a license. So yeah, those are some of the 3D software there. And so now we're going to talk about match moving, which is a process where they take all the photographed footage and then they're going to go and track it. So if you have a shot where your camera's moving around and you need to put a 3D element in it, you need to track your footage so that you can stick it in place and it looks like it's on the ground or it's flying around or whatever it's doing. So that would be called camera tracking. And what camera tracking is it's going to be looking at as the footage moves, kind of like I mentioned with the green screen earlier, it's going to look for little points. So you can see on this wall here, this is a software called 3D Equalizer. It looks for points of high contrast, and then as the footage goes on, it tracks those points. And then once it has all those points tracked, it can kind of get an understanding of the 3D space. So there's some more software, Synthize, PF Track. The picture shown here in PF Track is a different kind of tracking. So I mentioned camera tracking. There's also something called object tracking. So here they're object tracking this person's head so that they can put a mesh on its head. So another example of object tracking would be like if you tracked my hand, you could put like a sword in it or something. But the camera tracking is going to go ahead and be when you need to see how to place something in a 3D scene as the camera's moving. All right, so I've been talking a lot about CG and 3D models. So how are these guys made? So 3D models for visual effects and use in games, it is different for, like, if any of you guys know anything about like engineering, there's something called like CAD models. That is a completely different kind of 3D model. The 3D models that we use are created from polygons. So you can see here, this guy is this is a sheet made out of polygons. So there's 4 polygons, four. This is just like a giant cube with a bunch of polygons. Polygons are normally going to be square shaped, or like quads they're called, with 4 points, or like tris, 3 points. They can also be more points than just that. But these are essentially the building blocks of 3D models. So you can see here, this guy started with a cube, split it into a bunch of polygons, extruded it out, rotated all the polygons. And from these really basic operations, you can end up making really complex stuff. So you can see here on this motorcycle, you can see it's actually going to be made out of polygons. And this is the wireframe. I didn't include the fully rendered version, but you can see all of the polygons that it's made out of. So this is going to be something called hard surface modeling, which is essentially going to be anything that's not organic. So a motorcycle, vehicle, something like that is going to be hard surface modeled. This is a switchboard. I made this and I showed it was in my reel earlier. This is also a hard surface thing. So if I were going to go model a bike or a camera, hard surface modeling, which is going to be kind of these techniques with polygons and edge loops. And this guy right here, this is my friend Sasha from Nomen made this. You might say, oh, it's in like a squid octopus thing. That looks organic. But if you look closely, it's actually still a hard surface model because it's mechanical and it's made out of all these sheets of metal and mechanical parts. So then there's also organic modeling. So this is still going to be based on those polygons. However, it's going to be a lot more freeform, and it's going to be whenever you need to make something organic. So if we look in this bottom left here, this is my friend Elias. He was in game dev. So this is from the promo video that we shot for that. He has a pen tablet here. And so this is really cool if you guys have never seen this before. This is a software called ZBrush. And essentially you start with a circle or a sphere of digital clay. And you use your pen tablet or a mouse, but the tablet is preferred. You can essentially sculpt clay with a digital tablet. It's digital clay. So this guy, he started with this sphere, pulled the clay, built clay. Like it's digital, so you have like infinite clay. Clay is kind of just like an analogy. But from that sphere, he sculpted this whale here. And this crab from my friend Quabs was also sculpted from that clay. And so this head was probably also originally sculpted. And down here, we can see it's not just characters, creatures. It can also be just other organic stuff. So you could sculpt like a cliff face like this. So one thing you'll notice is this guy and this guy have the polygons shown. So while you're hard surface modeling, you're working with these really basic building blocks of polygons. But you might say, okay, if the polygons limit the level of detail, so you can actually see how this thing right here, we can see every line there is just based on where a polygon is. So there's not like, if I wanted to make a really bumpy little surface, on that, I would need a lot of polygons if I was doing it in the model. When you're sculpting, these sculpt brushes actually allow you to just kind of add polygons and resolution wherever you want. So you can see how high resolution the details are on this cliff. That's going to end up being millions and millions of polygons. And so essentially when you're using this 3D software, they can be pretty intensive on your computer. So you need to kind of optimize that. So that's why afterwards, when they're done sculpting something organic, they'll kind of use some of these hard surface techniques and change the way that the polygons are placed and kind of optimize it so that it is much lower polygon count, but still the same shapes. So next thing is UV unwrapping. This is kind of a little technical thing, but if we're going to be having a 3D model, so we saw here, this is just a gray 3D model, and then this one, gray 3D model. Those are just like visualization colors. What we want to do is we want to add textures to it. So we want to paint skin, we want to paint pores, we want to, if we have a mech, we want to add all the different colors. So how do we do that? These colors and textures are applied through image files that are they're called textures. But those are two-dimensional. The issue with that is that our models here are three-dimensional, which you can see. So what you have to do is you have to kind of change your model so that it is in a two-dimensional space, and that is called UV unwrapping. So the simplest example is this cube. You can see how you can you make cuts and you unwrap it, and that will make it so that you have a flat representation of this 3D cube. It gets more complicated for organic shapes, so you could kind of say it's kind of akin to skinning an animal. It looks a little bit like uncanny or scary, like on a person or a creature, but they essentially just flatten these 3D models. So you can see this person here, they just got flattened. So that is, I wouldn't want to be that person, unfortunately, but yeah. So for stuff like this, you can see this robot, this like mech looking thing. These are going to be the UV sheets for that. So all of these flat surfaces, they're going to basically make cuts and then flatten them out. And then once it's flattened out, it's flattened into a square. You can see all these are square shapes. That square, you can now start putting texture and color onto it. So like let's say this flat representation of this guy, if I put this in Photoshop, this grid, and then I painted like a red dot on the nose, and then I brought that texture back in, there would be a red dot on his nose in three-dimensional space, but I added it in two-dimensional space. So essentially UVing is the beginning of how you can start adding texture and color to your models. So you might imagine it might be kind of annoying to add texture and color to a flat representation of a model. So like if I wanted to make something go across the top of this guy's head, there's a seam there. His head is like split in that two-dimensional view. So it would be really hard to make it line up. So that's how you used to have to do it in Photoshop. But now there's software called like Substance Painter and Mari, and those are going to allow you to paint in three-dimensional space. So that will let you make the texturing process much easier and much more creative. So we can see here, this guy has shiny skin, it has different colors, you see all his pores, stains on his teeth, there's stuff that's metal. So when you're painting, how do you paint this? Do you have to like paint all the reflections and all that stuff? You actually don't. You actually are going to be painting these different channels, they're called. So first you're going to paint like base color, or you don't have to necessarily do it in order, but one of the things you'll paint is just the color. So this is going to be the blank color as if it was not lit and didn't have any material properties. The next thing you can paint is a map called roughness, which is only black and white, because white is going to mean it is rough. So if you painted white on something, it would not be very reflective because it's rough. If you painted black on something, it would be very reflective because it's not rough at all. And you can do that whole gradient between black and white. And you can see here on this metal, there's certain parts that are really shiny, and then where the rust is, it's more rough. So they painted, or they used other techniques, like there's some things called procedural techniques where you don't have to manually do stuff. It will kind of automatically apply to the surface based on rules that you give it. But yeah, so in general, you can paint different material properties. Another one would be metallic. So if something is not metal, you would paint it black. If something is metal, you would paint it white. So we can see here, this means this guy right here this part would be white metal, and this skin would not have a metalness, it'd be completely black. And all of these different textures come together in what's called a shader. So you can see in this example, this ball, this is just called a shader ball, it's just kind of like a preview 3D model for previewing stuff. It uses all of those textures, and together it coalesces in this shader. So you can see, okay, yeah, we see that color coming through. We see in some parts it's rougher, some parts it's shinier, some parts it looks less metal. So we can see right here it's black metal, so no metalness. right here, it doesn't look very metal. And so here's just some examples. So this is a cupcake that a Gnomon graduate made like 2 terms ago, I think, named Jill. So that is absolutely an insane render in my opinion. That looks absolutely gorgeous, and it's completely CG. This is, anyone seen the show Arcane? Yep, that's a great show. And so this is going to be an example where they really lean into the painting. You can see they really just used kind of traditional painting techniques to make it look very painterly when they were painting that model. Versus in the top left, this is going to be like more hyper-realistic. So that's just going to be texturing and shading. So once we have the modeling done, texturing done. Now we have all these little assets we have. So we have our trees, you know, just for whatever scene we're making, we can do our layout. So we're going to be laying out everything where it goes. And actually all of these were made by some of my friends at Gnomon. This is one of my favorite renders ever. It's absolutely gorgeous with this light. But so they have all these models like these benches, these lights, just this entire building. Everything here had to be modeled and textured. And so they lay it out and they compose their camera together. And so these are actually going to be, these images are fully done. But at this actual stage in the production, the lighting is not going to be there. It's just going to be completely flat lit. You'll just have your shaders, textures, everything. And the characters won't be done yet because I haven't spoken about that yet. But these are just examples of fully done environments done by environment artists. So next up is character artists. So this is some really cool stuff. So when I mentioned earlier organic, so sculpting, character artists are going to be sculpting these characters. And there's character artists, creature artists. They might do a dragon one day, or one year probably, one every few months, or person. Like they can do creatures and characters. So they'll sculpt, and then they can also use techniques like hard surface techniques. So you see this model, this character has like a metal here. This is one of my favorite character pieces of art ever. This is from Bavli, his name is. He's at Gnomon. All these are from Gnomon people. Like this sword, hard surface modeled, character, organic modeled. And so what they're going to do is these guys are going to just make these absolutely amazing characters that will be used in the film. So this is not a photograph, this is a CG render. So they can be hyper-realistic once again, or these two are stylized. Just whatever fits the need of the production. And so if you're doing this, if character artists in their personal work, they can kind of make whatever they want. But if they're doing it for production, they'll be basing it off of the concept art. So that right at the very beginning when we talked about that. And so another part of the character workflow is going to be groom. So you'll see here, there's digital hair on all of these guys here. So a groom artist is going to go and use software such as XGen or Yeti, which are Maya plugins, or it also exists in the software Houdini I mentioned. And they're going to create these kind of curves. And essentially they can be digital hairstylists, which is pretty cool. So here, just absolutely beautiful braids. And then another render, this is from Sasha, my friend. You can see here also the mustache, just little hairs going around everywhere. Eyebrows, that's also part of the groom. Another Gnomon student, this is a whole elk or deer. You can see all the guide curves here and then fully rendered. And then Alina, who's probably one of the best groom artists that I know. She graduated a little while ago. This is like a stylized tiger, but with realistic fur. So you can see here once again all the curves in the software, and then fully rendered, just that beautiful. You can see all the crazy curls and whiskers, stuff like that. So another part is CG clothing. So if any of you guys know anything about like clothes in real life, what you would do is you would have these flat patterns, and you can kind of see that a digital version of that here, because it's kind of like UV unwrapping, where you have these two-dimensional pieces of cloth, and you have to construct 3D pieces of clothing that you wear. So same thing in CG. So this is just a very basic example of a sweatshirt or a hoodie, but then it can also get super, super intricate and detailed. So they're going to use this software as Marvelous Designer, it's called. You can also do cloth sim and like Houdini, but Marvelous Designer is generally used for digital clothing. And so you can really get you'll basically create all these patterns. It'll kind of project them around whatever character you have, and then it can kind of shrink wrap around that character, and while it's doing that, it will simulate with a physics simulation, just that's in the part of the program, and you can tell it what the properties of the cloth are, and you can see it will like wrinkle up, or it will fold in certain ways, depending on the properties of the fabric. So yeah, and then another big part of CG clothing is the texturing and shading part that I mentioned. So you can see there's just really intricate shaders. And then this one actually has some hair simulation on it. You can see there's little fuzzy parts on this one. In general, these are just some really nice CG clothing. These are all from an artist named Pauline Boiteau. She's like a French artist who's just absolutely amazing. All right, so we saw earlier in my reel there was this guy here. So I did not actually sculpt this. I'm not a sculptor. This was sculpted by, when I mentioned I was in game development, my friend Bridge. She sculpted this, and then what I did is I rigged it. So when you're sculpting, like in ZBrush or whatever, you make these amazing characters. They're basically just statues at this point. So if they wanted to make this a full production character, they would probably sculpt it in what's called like a T pose or an A pose, where it's just like neutrally posed. These guys, since they just wanted like this absolutely beautiful art-directed pieces, and they just wanted a solo frame, kind of like a portrait photo, but it's a 3D render, they just sculpted it in that pose. But if you were to sculpt something in an A pose or a T pose, you can actually do something called rigging it. So however you sculpt it, it's like a statue. But what you can do is you can add these digital bones or these like skeleton, like a joints. And what that will do is it can, with a lot of work from a rigger, it can create this statue, and then from there, you can give it controls to be animated. So all these bones are at different parts of the joints throughout the body. And so once that's already done, and once you attach that to the model, you could go in and like, okay, I'm gonna rotate the joint here and here. That can get kind of annoying. So another huge part of a rigging artist's job is you see all these like shapes, these controls. These are just controls. They're called controls to help the animator. So an animator, if they wanted to move my arm up and all they had was joints, all they could do is like, and then they would have to rotate and then rotate. But a rigging artist can implement something where they have a control. So it's just the animator could grab like a floating circle and then move that, and then maybe it would, only moving that, it could move my whole arm like that. So a rigging artist is gonna go ahead and implement stuff like that. And there's a lot of different controls. And so here's like a frog someone at Noman made. It's also not just characters. So here's a car rig. So they have stuff for the wheels turning, doors opening, whole car turning, stuff like that. So yeah, once it's rigged, it can go ahead and be animated. So animation is going to use all those controls from the rig, and they're going to use the storyboards, art direction, just however they need this character to move, they're going to go ahead and make it move. So for like visual effects, if they're doing like a digital double, like something like a hyper-realistic model like this one or this one, what they're going to really focus on is getting that motion as close to realistic as possible. And so a lot of the time they will actually use motion capture, like I mentioned earlier, as a base. But motion capture is actually normally really messy, as in the data kind of gets all jittery, and a lot of the time their feet will float and stuff like that. So they'll clean up the motion capture data, and then from there, they'll add these artistic touches that weren't captured while still making it very realistic. If you're animating like this character or this witch character, it's probably going to be in a more, maybe not as serious, serious as in it needs to be realistic, but absolutely not discrediting stylization. Like that is an absolute art form. But they can kind of make it, they can take some more creative liberties with this motion. Like they can make them go like, they could have crazy like unrealistic movements that are stylized and really nice looking and really beautiful. And so up here, these are the principles of animation. There's 12 of them. So something like squash and stretch, anticipation, which would be like as you anticipate emotion, it kind of like, you can kind of feel it. There's like exaggerating stuff. There's follow through. So like setting something down, you wouldn't just go like, where you would like follow through with it. And then also like secondary motion. If I move my arm, it's not just that, it's moving like my whole torso. So animators have a lot to keep in mind, and it's actually quite a lot. It takes years of just like practice, and it's just a really cool craft, but they can essentially just bring all these characters and creatures to life. All right, so next is creature effects, which my roommate Gabe actually is working to become a creature effects artist. So creature effects, once you have all this animation and all these models, there's going to be some things. So like we have a groom artist who made, like this is another frame from Puss in Boots. This is a baby bear. They had the groom with all his fur. We want that fur to move though, and right now he's being like torn through a portal or something. And actually the creature effects artist who did this shot came and talked at Nomen at a stage for a presentation, so she went over this. So in this case, this is a creature effects shot where the fur is animating as it goes through this portal. And then she also mentioned this chain that had to be animated and simulated. So because it's like a physical object, it can be simulated how it moves, and also art directed and animated. And so those two aspects of the shot were done by creature effects because they are essentially things that are, it would take, so let's say if you had a character with saliva, like this guy right here, you could like hand animate saliva dripping down or something, or you could spend a lot of time creating a physics simulation setup where you could have saliva, you could set starting points, you could set the properties of the saliva, you could have guide curves, and you could simulate it and let the computer do the heavy lifting. That doesn't at all mean that the job is easy. It's actually quite a hard technical job to set those things up, but it's essentially something, it's setting up simulations. So again, that would be fur simulated here, chain simulation, that's creature effects. So creature effects is these simulations that have to do with the creatures and characters. Now, one of the coolest parts of creature effects, in my opinion, is going to be muscle simulation. So like I was mentioning earlier, it can be, some things are too hard to just manually animate. Let's say if this lion is walking, and as it walks, its muscles just pulse here. The animator is going to be animating, okay, walking like that, getting all the stuff in, but they're not going to have individual controls. Like that rig is not going to have a control for like, okay, muscle, like go out here and stuff like that. That would just be way too much. So not all characters and creatures have this, but for some characters and creatures, what they'll do is they'll actually sculpt every bone in its body and every muscle in its body, which you can see here. And then they can use very specialized software with very intensive setups, and they can simulate the muscle and fat and fascia and the skin rippling, which is super, super sick. So I'm gonna click on this, which, don't know why I did that, there we go. This guy just graduated Nomen, and this is an absolutely insane piece here. So this is a creature effects piece. So I'll play just the actual thing and then the breakdown. So pay attention. So he animated how the arm's moving, how it's blinking, but also look at its skin. Look at the secondary motion of the muscles and the skin. And then it's going to do a pretty exaggerated movement in a moment here. You can see how the skin just naturally moves and the fur naturally moves. So that's a creature, that's what creature effects would be doing here. And then he has a breakdown. So that's the original model, so that was sculpted, and then also some hard surface stuff. Then he sculpted every bone in its body, sculpted every muscle in its body, and then fascia laid on top of that, and then the fat and tissue, and then you can just see all of those elements work together, and they can simulate basically the anatomy of this creature for that secondary motion. And yeah, just to re-emphasize, just because you are using a computer to simulate does not make it, like that setup, probably to get that simulation, probably a month and a half, not even counting sculpting the bones and the muscles. So yeah, the computer doing the simulation part does not discount it because the artist has to set up these simulations. And honestly, go ahead. Yeah, just a tool. So creature effects, so visual effects in general, as opposed to someone maybe who's like a concept artist, it's going to be visual effects is a very technical art. But especially creature effects, and the next slide is going to be over just regular effects. Normally these guys' positions, or these people's positions, are effects TDs for technical director, because it's a very technical job, like I was saying. So they'll be writing code, they'll be using crazy physics simulation setups, stuff like that. So it's a very technical job. So people who aren't as into that, they might do something like animation or texturing. And those are technical and difficult in different ways. But it's not necessarily like, oh, math-based or physics-based. It's just like that artistic-based thing. But in general, visual effects is a really, really nice combination of the artistic and the technical. And different roles kind of have different amounts of that, pushing and pulling. So next slide is effects. So effects is specifically what I'm training to be, an effects TD. So this is going to be more physics simulation. So fire, magic, water, destruction, all of that stuff, explosions, obviously. And it's going to be, yeah, so effects is easily my favorite thing to do and also my favorite thing to look at. This is Love, Death, Robots. This is Bad Traveling, a ship burning down, completely CG. Anyone seen Love, Death, Robots? Yeah, really great CG series. So full CG shots. Fire is not real, completely simulated, set up by artists. This is Rogue One. This is when Jeddah, I think the planet is, gets hit by the Death Star, just being absolutely ripped apart. There's lightning, just rubble. Like, this is a huge scale simulation. WandaVision, here's just magic and power and stuff flowing around her, shooting around everywhere. Also simulated. Avatar 2, whale light creature, I don't know what that thing's called. Just this water, full CG shot, just beautiful water driplets, and it slides on the skin, shoots everywhere, it sheets together, there's foam, there's white water, there's foam. And then because I'm biased towards effects, because that's what I want to do, I have 2 slides. So Jeddah, another shot of the explosion, because of course there's explosions. This is from Dune. These are all just setups that are simulated by effects artists. This is Raya the Last Dragon. I haven't seen this movie, but this is some kind of like evil magic swirling thing. This is Mad Max Fury Road. This is kind of a crazy shot. There's like a tornado, lightning, cars on fire, giant sandstorm or windstorm or something. So effects is essentially going to be that. So setting up these physics simulations that, in my opinion, just look absolutely sick. And so something that blew my mind, which I'm going to show you guys, this is essentially, when I saw this the first time, this is what I knew for sure that I wanted to do visual effects and specifically do effects. I don't know if it will have the same impact on you, but so I always knew that there was like, okay, these VFX explosions. I thought what they did is they just exploded stuff in real life and then, like I said, composite it, so laid it on top. And it didn't click to me until I was like 15 and I saw this for the first time, which is a digital explosion being whirled around. And so this is extremely cool to me. This is a software called Embergen, which it's not really used in the industry because it can simulate in near real time, which means when you gain speed, you kind of lose quality. So even though this looks really good, it's not like up to the quality standards of something that like ILM would use. So they would do their explosion simulations in like Houdini, and that might take hours per frame, but this can show at like 20 frames per second. And also the shading isn't as good because it's real time, but I'll just play it and we'll see. So we're looking at it from the front, and it's like, okay, cool, it's an explosion, whatever. We're just looking at it from the front. And then the first time, though, that I saw this where, okay, no, it's a 3D object, you can orbit around it. This is like it was simulated on the computer and it's fully 3-dimensional. That really blew my mind the first time I saw that. Just gorgeous fire, smoke, everything. And yeah, Embergen has like a $70 student license, I think, so it's a little bit more expensive, but it's also a much smaller company. Okay, why does it keep doing that? That's wild. There we go. All right, so I earlier talked about layout. So at this point, we have everything laid out in our scene. We have all of our models, our textures. We have all of our characters done now. We have all of our effects elements. So you can see here there's like some dust in the air, some smoke. That also would count as effects, even though there's not a giant explosion. What they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and light it. And so if it's a visual effects shot where they're integrating with footage, the goal is going to be to match the lighting on set. So that's why we took here. These are all 3 CG balls that are lit within a 360-degree panorama HDRI. That's the thing I mentioned earlier. So they can use that to match lighting on set. And then let's say, okay, there's a spotlight here on set. They measured where that was. The VFX supervisor made sure to take measurements. So, okay, boom, they can place a CG one. And then they'll be lighting their CG objects so that they look like they fit in the footage. If it's full CG, so like this is A Secret Life of Pets, this is just student work from Noman, and then this is just like a demonstration of lighting without any textures on it. If it's full CG, they just fully light with these digital spotlights, these digital like area lights, these digital suns, stuff like that. And it's really just a really beautiful, creative, nice decision. You can make these beautiful gold rays, just see what you want to kind of build and contrast, what you want to show off, what you want to hide in shadow, stuff like that. So lighting is pretty much one of the final steps before we render out. And then we're going to go ahead and render. So this whole time we've been working in these 3D software with these 3D scenes, and we're looking in our viewport with very rough approximations. So actually I'm going to go back a lot of slides here. Actually, this shows it. You see here how this is kind of like, it kind of just looks, I'll say it looks bad, but it's just because it's a viewport preview. Once we render with our lights and everything, it's going to turn those basic 3D models, and it's going to go ahead and make it, with our final lighting, it's going to take our final shaders, and it's going to create our final image. So this is kind of a split out view of a 3D render. So on the far left, this would be what the final render looks like. But we can see there's like kind of different passes within it. So this one right here, it is kind of annoying how it only shows a very small section. But this pass, remember when I mentioned all the different textures? So we'll have one for color, metalness, how rough something is. It'll look at first just the color. It'll see what color everything is. Then it'll do like lighting calculations and multiply it. Like it'll add on that color. And essentially it'll do all these in a step by step by step by step. And when it combines them all together, all these different passes, it can go ahead and create this fully rendered image. And then so all these passes, you can also optionally render other passes. So this one right here with all these colors, it assigns a different color to each object in your scene, which means when you're working with this rendered image in the next step, compositing, you can isolate objects and be like, okay, I want to make this thing more green, but I don't want to make the whole thing more green. If you didn't have this pass, you would have to manually go in and draw out a mask, but this will automatically kind of give you a mask for that. And there's a bunch of other passes that help with that. And then another thing here, this is just a really basic scene. This is a light up here. This first image just shows direct lighting, so it's just light hits it. And then this next one is a big part of rendering is indirect lighting or global illumination, which is where that light goes here, and then just like in real life, like you'll see with photography or cinematography, you have those giant white reflectors. Light bounces, so the light will hit this ground, and then it'll bounce back up, and you see how here the bottom of the sphere is lighter, and then it will also bounce from the sphere, so you can see there's a bit of green bleeding on to the wall there. Might be too hard to see on the monitor, but there's some orange from here as well. So essentially just all of these processes, this is kind of just an overview, but you'll render your image, and then you'll bring it to compositing. So compositing is a lot of heavy lifting. This will use software like Nuke is the industry standard, and After Effects is more used like on an indie level. And that's what I used for a while. I switched to Nuke a little bit ago though. So here, compositing can also be done in full CG. So this is my friend Quinzel. This is the raw render from her scene. And then in compositing, she did stuff like she changed the rays. She kind of affected the lighting a little bit, added some fog, and then in the actual render, there's a fire that goes on this candle. So that's full CG compositing. You can kind of just elevate your image. And then VFX compositing is normally going to be a very, very different result here because you're going to have actor shot on green screens, and then all of a sudden now you're going to be integrating it with all of the stuff you received from your CG department. So like the CG department will deliver to VFX the renders of like this planet exploding and all that stuff, and then compositing is going to go ahead and combine them together. And so what that's going to involve is, okay, maybe we shot with a shallow depth of field, which means that's basically when like whatever you're focused on in the camera is in focus and everything else is blurry. So one thing you'd be like, okay, maybe you have to match the depth of field, so you blur your CG elements. Some film, if you're shooting on a print film, there's something called halation, which is where during really bright lights, there's like a red kind of contrasty streak. So if you did that, you would add that into your CG elements if there's any really bright lights. Just kind of stuff like that. Like when you shoot video, it compresses the video, and you can see there's kind of artifacts sometimes. You might see like if you play a really low quality video, or if you see a low quality JPEG, there's artifacts. And so these CG renders are perfect because it's literally just like 3D models perfectly rendered. So what you can do is you basically make them look worse, and then that makes it match with the footage more. So you can blur them a little bit, you can add artifacts, stuff like that. Also noise, when you shoot footage, there's normally a lot of noise. If you render something in 3D without enough samples, it's called, which basically just means you just have to wait longer. 3D renders can also be noisy, but the noise won't look the same. So you render them without noise as best as possible, and then you can match the noise level of the footage. So essentially you just need to match all this stuff, like match the exposure, contrast, and then on top of that you can add stuff like, you see there's a lens flare that is over the CG element and also this VFX plate. And you can also they can draw like shapes on the actors and make it look like the light is hitting them from the CG elements if that was not done on set, stuff like that. So it's going to be keying out green screens. If I had a CG like dog behind me, like somehow standing really tall, and I put my hand in front of it in the footage, when I'm putting the CG element on top, it's like that. So my hand would not be in front. So you can do something called rotoscoping, which would be like drawing a mask around my hand, and then now I can cut that out, put my hand in front of the dog. So that's going to be a big part. This is a screenshot from the software Nuke. These are all called nodes. Once you guys get into like DaVinci Resolve, you'll see some nodes. Not really, After Effects and Premiere don't really have node-based workflows. But essentially, like these ones at the top is, okay, here's my footage, here's my render, and all of these nodes are just little operations, and you can see these lines all connecting them, and it's basically just doing more operations on top of each other, combining them together, and at the very bottom is the end result. So you can see how much goes into compositing. Like you just kind of add everything together and composite it together so it all fits really nicely. And this video was not playing earlier, but since we have a bit more time, I'll just see if I can get it to play. Maybe not. This is a reel from, this is just a compositing reel just to show some examples, but I guess just from the thumbnail you can see how much compositing can do. So this guy was shot on a green screen with a horse, and then the compositor took all this, these like CG elements and matte paintings, and then composited it together. So it goes from the footage to the composite. All right, and now we're back at this graph. So that whole time we were at this VFX part. We had all of our footage. And now we're done with VFX. After we've gone through all the dailies process where the director's reviewing stuff, your leads are reviewing stuff. But once you have your final lock on your VFX, what you can do is you send it to editing. You send what's called proxy files, which is basically just like regular video files that look regular. And then the editing department is able to integrate that into the edit, see if there's any last edit changes they want to make. And then once they do that, you will actually send your essentially what is raw files to the grading office. So these guys you sent regular files, and then you'll send the grading and DI some bigger files that have more information. And then so this DI or digital intermediate is going to finish the film. So it's called grading, DI, digital intermediate, or finishing. So they'll receive all the footage. They'll use this same edit decision list that VFX got to match the edit exactly. They'll do their color grading. They'll do their sound effects. They'll integrate all the VFX shots inside, and then the movie will be done. And then note on video games really quickly. So I mentioned I did game development for my second year when I was a senior. And you might be like, okay, wow, film and games is pretty different. In terms of the CG part of visual effects, there's a lot of overlap actually. So same stuff, modeling, texturing, animating, rigging. There are nuances and differences. So for example, this is the game version of my switchboard. You can see how there's not very many polygons. And essentially, the more polygons you have, the more kind of like nuance and fidelity to like edges and stuff. You can see how these are just perfectly sharp edges, so it wouldn't look that good. So in games, you have these really low polygon models because games have to run really fast. In a movie, you can afford to render a frame. Like a 3D renders take ages. Like it might be like 48 hours to render a single frame of like 24 in 1 second. And you have to do one for like 2 days. In video games, you have to render like 60 frames each second. So you have to make it a lot lighter to run. So you'll have these low polygon models, and then in your texture, you'll just try and like fake the detail a little bit. And then another thing with the limitations of speed, when I was mentioning effects and like explosion simulations and water simulations, that will not run fast enough for a video game because those will also take like hours for a single frame of an explosion to simulate because it has to do all the gas advection and all that stuff. So what they do is normally they have more stylized game effects that are kind of just like paintings and like very basic stuff that's not simulated, which does not necessarily mean it looks bad. It just means that for video games, you just have to kind of optimize more. And just to show it doesn't look bad, this environment from earlier from Sasha is a games environment. So that runs in real time. Same here, these two are from Unreal Engine 5, which you guys may have heard of. It's a game engine, and it just got some updates that makes it a lot easier to run just like really nice looking images. But all that is to say, some CG stuff between visual effects and video games is pretty similar. So if any of you guys do get into some of this kind of stuff and you're a junior, since you can only do this program for a year, I would recommend game dev, definitely. And now that is the end, so feel free to connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn, and then I am able to answer any questions before I head out.